This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Where'd you get those shoes? Easy. They're from DSW. Because DSW has the exact right shoes for whatever you're into right now. You know, like the sneakers that make office hours feel like happy hour. The boots that turn grocery aisles into runways. And all the styles that show off the many sides of you, from daydreamer to multitasker and everything in between. Because you do it all in really great shoes. Find a shoe for every you at your DSW store or dsw.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to an extraordinary man. It's going to be an extraordinary conversation, I can promise you as well. The man's name is Paul Williams. He is a film director and he's just written a memoir called Harvard, Hollywood, Hitmen and Holy Men. Paul Williams was a figure of enormous importance in the 1960s, 70s counterculture. Coming out of Harvard, he kind of knew everybody, and you'll hear about his career as we go, but I feel I need to add a little bit of background because his is a history which has somewhat been erased. Recently, a week or so prior to this conversation, the noted, famed producer Ed Pressman died. Pressman started his career with Paul Williams as a collaborator. The nature of that collaboration is discussed during this conversation. But together they formed a company called Pressman Williams, which was instrumental in shepherding into production and to life a number of very important films, including Terrence Malick's Badlands. When Pressman died, there was nary a mention of Paul in the obituaries, but I think that it's important to recognise that those early De Palma films, those early Malick films, were produced by Paul Williams and Ed Pressman, not just one of the two. He has had such a career. Partly, I think, to do with a political awakening, partly to do with a spiritual awakening. He has, to some extent, marginalized his own film work until now with this memoir, which hopefully will do something towards putting him into his rightful position. His movies feature some of the best actors of the period, including Robert Duvall, Seymour Cassel, John Voight, who has a very early important role, he made a film. His first film was called Out of It. It was made in 1969, starring Barry Gordon and John Voight. Then The Revolutionary, again John Voight and Robert Duvall, came in the 1970s. In 1970. Then he made Dealing. He made a whole bunch of movies. Miss Wright, The November Men, and some of his failed movies are more interesting than some people's made movies, including And the Walls Came Tumbling Down, which was about a biopic of John Paul II. Anyway, all of this is kind of covered, but I just wanted to preface this conversation much more than I usually do with these conversations, as you probably have just noticed, because I think it's vital to sort of understand just how amazing it is to talk to Paul and to have access to his memories and to his ideas when he is really a key figure who deserves to be much better known in this period. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. If you do, remember to like and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. Thanks go to Elliot Atkins for the music and to Ali Harwood for the art. And enjoy the conversation.
Playing a little cat and mouse game here with you for a little bit because you're a bright guy, and so I'm told. And so I did some things on a literary level in that book that normally you don't see.
Right.
And I was wondering if you cognited on the system I was using to make it so immediate.
Well, there was definitely a sort of almost like it was almost like poetry at some points, that it would have this sort of nucleus. It was sort of everything extraneous was gone, and there was some very
right. I got you. Yeah. That was the first thing, was to get rid of everything, to try to keep it action and dialogue only, and to let the audience take the emotional significance. Right. And I was not trying to tell anybody what to think about this, except maybe a little political, stuff that drove me to South America. But the other thing, this whole mosaic of vignettes, I thought was sort of an interesting. I had never quite seen that before.
And the whole idea as well of you sort of having the years going by, and it was almost like it. I tell you something it reminded me of a little bit was almost like the voiceover of a noir film.
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting because somebody mentioned it to me the other day. He did see what that was all about. Is that most memoirs are written from the point of view of the old wise man telling you about, how wonderful, and blah, blah. The thing he liked so much about this was that everything was told from a contemporary point of view, from the point of view of the character at that moment, who hadn't yet become. He still had a life. You sort of took the trip with his evolving point of view on his own experience.
Absolutely. It's sort of against the David Copperfield sort of Charles Dickens model of, whether I'm the hero of these pages, we are to see.
Right. The exact opposite. And the other thing I thought was interesting, a lot of this, I think, people like the book, but I think a lot of the reasons it works aren't clear. But I think one of them is simply that it's really an anti-ego book. Most memoirs are there to show you how wonderful, great, what personality I become. Whereas this is how I became a fool.
It's sort of antithetical to the whole idea of autobiography. Then,
right. Well, in the West, I would imagine it would be a pretty good autobiography in some mystical clan somewhere.
How long did it take you to write? How because it's
about 6 years. Well, what happened is I started the book originally started from two germinal ideas. One, my best friend Charlie Plotkin, who is a music producer, brilliant guy, and I've known him for 40 years, and he said, you really got to deal with this Goldberg thing, which is something I never really had dealt with publicly.
So Goldberg was your birth name.
Yeah, and I changed it just before I went to Harvard, or my father changed it. And so really, it was coming to terms with that identity problem. That was one thing. Yeah, in a certain sense, that's how. And the other side of it was that throughout my life, I've had what some people, most Westerners would call, have had mystical experiences. But between you and me, I've had extraordinary. They're extraordinary. There's no way I can tell my Harvard roommates about this, right? They'll think you're, But hey, it has been one of the central facts of my life that I see things in mystical realm, what people call mystical realms, but they're not. They're things like distant seeing, or essential forms, or all kinds of things which are, Plato writes about it. But until I met Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who was the current Dalai Lama's principal teacher. And he showed me what this stuff was. This was not my, it's accessible to any human being if you want to put the time in to learn such things. Of course, we don't have the time. Who has the time, right? Yeah, but it's been a big part of my life. And I just started out just making a list of all the most extraordinary things that I had seen, extraordinary. And I was going to just tell the story of those two themes, how the extraordinary evolved and merged into a life point of view, and how I dealt with my identity problem. And those things are not totally unrelated. One represents the ego and the other represents the essence, so that's going on in the book. I don't think anybody conceptualizes it that way or very few people understand it that way. They'll either take it from one point of view or another point of view. But I think the overall effect is one that they're not completely aware of. That is moving themselves towards their own more essential self.
I mean, I guess that's the core. I mean, in that sense, it's not antithetical to the whole idea of autobiography, because you are asking those essential questions of who am I, where do I come from, where am I going? And that idea of, you have those extraordinary moments of sort of visions, and as you say, you sort of perceiving things which are happening contemporaneously but at distant. They sort of skip like pebbles across the surface of the book. You have them in a whole, series of moments. They also have a way of sort of stitching the book together, if you know what I mean. It sort of gives you this sort of consistency. Yeah. So let's go back. So we'll go back right to the beginning, where your family background. A lot of people who are listening to this obviously won't yet have read the book, but will. So we don't want to spoil too much for them. But if you could just give us a general idea of your background and life before. I mean, your first chapter is sort of where I came from, so it has that element to it.
How do we say this? Well, imagine John Stuart Mill Sr. living in the Bronx. Now, I don't know where is your audience? Is it in Europe here?
It's international. It's all over the place.
Okay, so people know what the Bronx is?
I imagine so, yeah.
Oh, all right, cool. So that's basically, if I had to explain where I come from the, lower middle class streets in the Bronx with a father who is not very different from John Stuart Mill Sr. So that's basically, and a mother, of course, who was, what would you say, excessive in her love. Huey Newton used to say the same thing about his mother.
Really?
And, oh yeah, there's a part in the book about that, I think, unless they took it out.
Yeah, no, I think there is. You're right.
Huey and I used to talk a lot about our mothers and what excessive love meant emotionally growing up. And the thing we agreed on, that it was sick to receive that much love from your mother, is unbalanced. It's emotionally not healthy. But what it does do is it gives you an experience of overwhelming love as an infant. And then you spend your rest of your life never accepting love because it's not equal to that excessive amount you got as a very young child. And so you keep moving forward, trying to find that love in a great, whether it's from economics or politics or revolution or women, right? That there's always this quest. You're always willing to give up what you've achieved because you know what it felt like, Anyway, but it's all unconscious. But so I'd say those are the two things that were going on where I came from.
So then you have that moment when your father sort of decides that you would be better if you go to Harvard, you'd be better going under a sort of anglicized name as Williams rather than as Goldberg. And as you said,
in fairness to my father, he said I could pick any name.
Right, okay.
And I said my middle name was Williams, so let's make that my last name.
Right.
But, I didn't know that, and I left the original Williams, so it was Paul William Williams.
Right.
And at the time, I didn't realize how it's just, it would sound a name that you would expect Bugs Bunny to have. Paul William Williams. That's all, or somebody. Was William Carlos Williams who writes in the vernacular would have been a much better. And so it was just a confused and upset teenager who was told he was going to have a new name. I hadn't even been laid under that name. You know what I mean? I was a virgin.
It's so interesting as well because it's how going to university is the period where you usually do have an opportunity to go and reinvent yourself. I mean, you're going with a different self altogether before you've even had the chance to reinvent yourself. What are you going to kick against if they?
Well, it's interesting. That's a very good point. But it's interesting because I came to have Eric H. Erickson as my tutor junior year. Do you know of this fellow?
No.
Eric Erickson? Oh my goodness! He wrote a book called Childhood and Society. He wrote a book called Young Man Luther. And he won the National Book Award for Gandhi's Truth. He's probably the preeminent psychoanalyst of the second half of the 20th century. He invented the whole idea of life cycle, studying the whole life cycle, psychoanalysis and history, doing Luther, young man Luther, about his having an identity crisis. That's what created Protestantism. And then, so he became my tutor, the man who invented the idea of an identity crisis. That's his concept. In the 8 stages of man, identity versus, anyway, where are we going? Oh, yeah. So Erickson became my tutor, who's, when I went to Harvard, was perhaps the most famous guy at Harvard. I mean, you should Google him. He's not a minor character in this area. Anyway, the point is that I found out, I wrote some papers for him, which he really liked, and I went to see him in private. I found out, he didn't tell me, that the Eric H. Erickson, was Eric Hamburger Erickson. And that just before he came to teach at Harvard Medical School, he dropped the Hamburger and became Eric H. Erickson. And he never told me that, even though I was writing all these papers about identity and who am I. I mean, the Jews don't like me, the Christians don't like me. I'm an outsider to the outside. I took the whole idea of marginality. How far out on the margin can you go? One thing then I later found out after he died was that his mother, who was Jewish, had an extramarital affair with a German and then married Hamburger. She said he took, then married Erickson. In other words, his mother had been married to a man named Hamburger. Then she had an affair, and then she went to Dr. Erickson. And Eric Erickson always said, well, he took the name Erickson because that was the man who brought him up, and he identified with that. So, but what he didn't ever reveal to me is he was the progeny of some German, possibly Nazi. You know, it was
And this is the guy who invented the identity crisis, just to be absolutely clear.
Yes, absolutely. You read up on this guy and won the National Book Award for Gandhi's Truth. Wow. Anyway, he's a revered character in psychoanalysis. He worked with Anna Freud in London, by the way. When he first started out, he was an artist. Anyway, so Erickson ended up being my tutor, and I wrote a lot about marginality for him too.
When does this start? When do you start sort of getting into film as a thing? Are you what? When you're at Harvard, are you watching a lot of movies? Are you interested in the art form, or are you just sort of interested in lots of cultural things here?
None of the above. I was a lower middle class kid, and I took pictures, photographs. I was definitely a bit of a prodigy. From a very young age, I took really good photographs. I sometimes think it's like, some kind of visual equivalent of Stevie Wonder. I'm tone deaf. I'm very bad with music, but I can see incredibly. And so I always took really good photographs. And then when I got to Harvard, I started out on the Harvard Crimson as a photographer. I was chosen to be at the end of my freshman year. And so I was taking a lot of pictures, and they were being published all over the place. And junior year, Harvard gave the first course in photography. And of course, zillions of people came. They only took 20. And I was the one that they took. And then the next year, they hired me to help teach the course. I was still an undergraduate, which is unheard of, frankly. So I knew, I talk about it in the book. I wanted to go to Europe. I wanted to study the great painters. And I was really interested in how they saw things. How people see is very interesting to me. Anyway, so I didn't have any money, so I looked around for an anthropologist that maybe would hire me to take pictures for their study. And I found one, Lawrence Wiley, the C. Douglas Dillon Professor of French Civilization at Harvard. And he loved my pictures, and he said, yes, he'd definitely send me to Europe and shoot pictures for his book. And C. Douglas Dillon was Secretary of the Treasury of the United States of America.
Wow.
So Wiley got Dillon to give me some extra money to shoot some movie footage, too, in the village of Chanzeau. And so in some sense, that was the first. Well, that wasn't. Well, in a way, that was the first movie. It was given to me because I couldn't afford to go to Europe. The only way I could go is if I made movies and took pictures. And I wanted to see the great artists. And but earlier, I had decided I was a really good photographer, and I walked off the street. I still remember this in Manhattan to Time Life. And went to I was, 18, 19 years old. And I said, look, I'm a better photographer than the guys you have working for you. So I said this to the guard. He must have thought I was out of my mind. And he said, well, why don't you go upstairs to see, and he gave me the name Anne Guerin, who worked at Life magazine. And I went up to see her, and she's a very sweet woman in her 40s, And I said, look, I can take better pictures than you putting in Life magazine. You should be giving me a job. And I showed her all my pictures. And she said, look, these are very good pictures, but if you really want to do this, you have to tell a story in pictures, not just a bunch of good photographs. And she says, go do a story on something and then come back. And so that, my freshman year, I was 6'3", I weighed 165 pounds. And they picked the Harvard crew coach, very, old line New England people, asked me to row for Harvard. So there were 7 of these Andover, Exeter, Theodore Roosevelt IV. It was just, the kings and princes of New England, right?
Right.
And me.
From the Bronx.
Yeah. And so I rode my freshman year and that was probably the biggest part of my education, the freshman year, even though I was reading a lot. I'd never seen up close the establishment and how they lived, what their values were, and how they talked, which started my radicalization process, I must say. Nevertheless, at the Life magazine, I decided to do a film story on the Harvard crew. And I did. I spent 3 months shooting them on the river and everything. And when I was done, I brought it back to Life. And she saw them, Dan Guerin, and she said, well, go upstairs to Sports Illustrated. So I went upstairs, and there's a guy named George Bloodgood there. I still remember, very nice guy. And he said, these are great. We're going to run this a big story this summer in Sports Illustrated, all about the Harvard crew going to the Olympics, because the Harvard heavyweights are supposed to be in the Olympics. And so that was great. So then I go to France, to shoot in the summer, to shoot the still photographs for the village of Chanzeau and expose the movie footage, along with a guy named Tom Yeager. He also shot some of the movie with me. Nice guy. Just before I went to Chanzeau, I was sitting on this, on some park bench in Paris. Actually, it was near the Seine. It was along the Seine. And I read in the Herald Tribune, Schwerner and Cheney are shot to death, blah, blah, blah. Upsetting. But even more upsetting was the headline which said, Harvard crew upset by Vesper Boat Club. The Harvard crew got upset, and Vesper from Philadelphia beat them, and they weren't going to go to the Olympics.
There goes your story.
There goes my story. Fuck. Very toss. Anyway, I finished shooting I shoot for 3 weeks in Chanzeau, and then I get a Uriel pass. I got one before I went. I spent 8 weeks going to all the great museums of Europe, which was my real purpose in going there, and studying light and composition and just curious how they saw things. Anyway, when I got back, this is all in the book. When I got back, I went to Life, and they said, well, they'll run a couple of pictures, but, there's no story, obviously.
Right.
But they gave me about 1,100 incredibly beautifully printed 11 by 14 prints of all my pictures.
Right.
They gave it to me free. That was worth like, $50,000, a lot of money to get that kind of stuff. Anyway, I had no money. There's a theme here all through this thing, no money. How do you make all this happen with no money? So that fall, John and Faith Hubley, who were Academy Award-winning animators, gave a course in animation, and everybody wanted to be in the course, so you couldn't get in. But I went in and I said, look, you're going to need somebody to take the pictures of everybody's artwork each day, to see on the Oxbury animation stand, which costs, hundreds and hundreds of dollars an hour back then to use. Anyway, I said, I volunteered to do that job, which nobody else at Harvard would do. Who would waste a quarter, to just shoot other people's stuff? They took me in a second. By the way, John Hubley invented Mr. Magoo. I don't know if you know who Mr. Magoo is.
Yeah, absolutely. The short-sighted cartoon character, yeah.
All right. So anyway, he knows a Magoo when he sees it. Anyway, I got the job. But really, during the day, I was editing together the French movie, and then at night, I would go hide in the men's room while they locked up the building. And then once the building was locked and I was all alone, I'd run back into the animation room and use my 11 by 14s of the crew to make a movie out of the stills. And so senior year, I was doing the documentary. I was doing the movie of the stills. And then this is a long story, but that's when I was starting to think, hey, I think maybe I could make a movie.
Right.
It's not like I knew anything about movies or culture or film. I just think I technically am very good at manipulating people. I also know how to move a camera and expose film. I remember seeing at the Brattle, I think it was an Olmi film, some Italian movie. And I watched it. I didn't know what they were saying. It was in Italian. But I watched what was happening very closely. And I said, I could do that. Right. I could create that. So I really went into film as simply, I discovered there was something I knew how to do.
And with your first film, I mean, it's really interesting reading that and knowing about the photography background, because your first film, of course, you have the character at the very beginning, sort of photographing women on a beach, and it's coming. It sort of feels like it starts from that very autobiographical beginning.
But it's frankly, I think it was a little bit. I was smart enough to know that I didn't know anything, so I did do something incredibly personal where I did know. I mean, I was acutely aware that I was not a writer,
right,
at that point. And I said, well, but I'm going to have to write because I can't afford to hire a writer. So I better write about stuff I know about. It's happened to me. And I just wrote down, I spent a year writing down things on 5x8 index cards, scenes. And then spent an immense amount of time just putting them on the floor and rearranging them in different orders to see if I could make a movie out of it, which I did eventually. There's a little footnote to that. Many years later, not many years, well, how many years later? Yeah, about 4 or 5 years later, I was at Francis Coppola's house. And I went up to his writing room with him, and this was before computers and laptops. And I had spent, a year looking at the floor of all these index cards, right? Rearranging them. But on one wall of his room was made of metal. And he had these little magnets with clips on them. So you could clip a index card on it. And so he didn't have to look down at the floor and hurt his neck. Francis could sit back in his chair and keep rearranging them. Anyway, that's a tiny little detail.
It seems like a consistent strain throughout your story of sort of hitting things sideways almost by sort of thinking of things in the more mechanics of it. How do I put this together? How does a story work? From bits, from the still photographs to the moving picture, from the index cards to the script.
But plus, I also, John Voight, when we were making The Revolutionary.
So the first film is Out of It, which you make, and John Voight has a small but important role in that. And Out of It, I would describe, I think you describe it in the book yourself as a sort of precursor to American Graffiti, as a sort of college movie about,
high school.
Yeah, exactly. Wanting to have sex and break into the world of adulthood, I guess.
Well, but it was also about the utter tyranny of the belief system of the adolescent high schools in suburbia.
Yeah,
and
being cool.
It was a little bit ahead of its graffiti, and The Graduate and all those things came later. It was like a report from the front about what life was like. It wasn't, most movies, if you ever see Apocalypse Now or all kinds of, they're made 10, 15 years after the events. They're not made in the midst of the things that are happening. But all my films I made in the midst of it. So it's really out of it was made when that was happening, not looking back on it from a nostalgic point of view. The Revolutionary I made in the middle of the revolution, for Christ's sakes, and it took 2 years to make. So by the time it was done, the people had moved past that. But in any event, getting back to the psychology of perception and seeing. I remember one night when we were doing a night shoot on the Revolutionary with John, and it's a scene, we just saw Tommy Lee Jones, who had a small part. That was how Tommy Lee Jones got a SAG card. Anyway, John has to be picked up by an army truck to warn the black revolutionaries that the army is going to come in on them the next day. And we were trying to figure out what his emotions would be for that scene. And he had some ideas, and he said, but have I done that yet already, those colors? And I said, well, wait a second. Give me 2 minutes. I'll run the movie. And I could just sit there and run the whole movie in my head, every take. That was pretty amazing to me. And I said, nope, you haven't done those. It's okay.
Is that part of do you think that's part of your sort of not extra sensory perception, but that sort of, insight and vision that you have?
One, of course, I don't really know. But two, I'm willing to spin a theory on most anything, but I don't know. I don't know for sure at all. But it is an ability to concentrate at an extreme level for long periods of time. And in that sense, that almost sounds like somebody who's autistic. But I'm socially kind of gifted, so. But yet, it does seem to have aspects of autism.
Right.
So I'm not sure what it is. But yeah, but of course, I've always been interested in what it is. So I mean, I got I graduated from Harvard with a Summa in the psychology of perception. Of course, I flunked my oral exams. That's a great story in the book.
When you start making films, that's when you begin a relationship as well with Ed Pressman, who becomes becomes a producing partner essentially. You have a company together, and as we're recording this, we're about I think a week after Ed sadly died. What's your how do you get together with him?
Well, I don't know if you want me to tell the story because I certainly tell the whole Ed Pressman story in the book.
Sure.
And I can certainly recount to you some of those things if you'd like me to. But my history with Ed is extraordinary and unknown. I mean, Ed just died, so I really don't want to say anything negative about him. But he sure had some sides which did some violence to me.
I mean, yeah, there's this aspect, and fair enough. You don't want to necessarily get into anything which is overly negative of a man who's just gone. But I mean, from the get go, it's like you already sort of you are a very much creative person who's making these films, and Ed is more involved with the business side of it. Would that be a fair assessment?
No.
Okay.
That's certainly what he would like folks to know. I just wrote, well, it's in the book, and I just sent it to my old college roommates who were all reading the obituaries. It's in the book, where I teach them how to take movie. Yeah, I'm going to read it to you. Should I read it to you?
No, but by all means, you could just. I mean, I've read the book, obviously, but
okay. Well, his hallmark as a producer was this little notebook he used to carry around with him, a black and white composition book.
Right.
Well, I taught him, he didn't know how to. Well, you can read it in the book. Anyway, when the Museum of Modern Art had a retrospective 25 years later of Pressman films, finally, after 25 years, he said from the stage, Paul Williams really taught me how to be a producer. And gave me the method and the confidence. Look, when I met Ed, he couldn't talk. I had to bring him to London Hospital to get his jaw. I made all the social networking contacts for the company for the first 5 years.
Right.
And I showed him how to go about doing things. I was pretty savvy. Right. And I taught Ed. And then, anyway, it's all in the book.
Yeah.
But the idea that Ed did all the business. No, I was busy networking to Scorsese, I found De Palma, Bert Schneider, Bob Rafelson, John Boyd, Bob Duvall. Well, all these people that came into Pressman, Williams. Even the name of the company was supposed to be Williams Pressman, but I had all my Goldberg promise. I didn't want anybody to think about my name too much. I said, let's call Pressman Williams. But anyway. Look, these things are facts. Okay, the facts are that I took them under my wing,
and as you say, you're in the middle of this explosion of talent, which is coming out and will sort of become the new Hollywood. I love the bit where you're meeting Martin Scorsese and this guy's talking about movies and nothing but movies, and you're like, okay. And all these, Tommy Lee Jones gets his SAG card as a result of appearing in The Revolutionary. John Voight gets his first break with you.
No, John Voight actually made a horror film called Frank's Great Adventure before out of it.
Oh, that's
right. A low-budget horror movie.
Yeah. But your movie didn't come out until after Midnight Cowboy, right?
Right. Yeah, no, I was, instead of being the genius who, first found out about the 50s, I still remember David Pickert, United Artists, said, look, it's in black and white. You got no stars. John Voight was just casting him as a Midnight Cowboy. We'll wait till after Midnight Cowboy. At least then you'll have a star in your movie. But I would tell them, forget it. It'll be old hat by now. Everybody's picking up on this. We're 2 years ahead of everyone. And in 3 years, it's going to be, no, I was right. In fact, when I went to London to make The Revolutionary, Richard Lester was working at the same studio as I was in Twickenham. So we used to have lunch sometime. And he would say, he was much older than I was. He would say, films have a zeitgeist, he thought, for about 6 months. There was the cultural moment changes every 6 months or so. And you can have a wonderful film and it can just come out in the wrong time. And you can have a horrible film, but it's the zeitgeist just right, and it does wonderfully. And frankly, we missed our window of opportunity without it. When it came out, it was old hat. I mean, when I went to Berlin Festival with it, George Stevens, a great American director, was going to give it the Golden Bear. Then 2 days before the awards, the German students rioted and closed down the festival. So they're parts.
A little self-care can go a long way, especially amidst the hustle and bustle of the holidays. That's where Vegamore comes in. Trusted by millions, Vegamore is all about giving your hair the love and care it deserves. With their vegan and cruelty-free formulas, you can nourish and revitalize your strands while indulging in some much-needed pampering. Because let's face it, who couldn't use a bit more me time this time of year? Go to vegamore.com/ACAST, code ACAST. That's vegamor.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
There are parts of my life that have been very lucky and parts of my life that have been very unlucky.
It's also that thing of living in a revolutionary period, isn't it? Of sort of like you're into the revolution, you're into the sort of zeitgeist that's going on there, but at the same time, it's like it's not very conducive to having a sort of a career trajectory, which is.
Well, listen, you keep in mind, I was in Algiers with Eldridge Cleaver,
right?
Don Cox, who else? His wife was there. That woman who became quite famous. Black philosopher at Berkeley, woman.
Angela Davis.
It was me, Angela Davis, Eldridge, his wife, Big Man East, and Don Cox, who was the area captain. I mean, I was in Algiers, and when I discover, I'm going to do some documentary footage to raise money for Bobby Seale's trial in New Haven. And when I realized, when I go to my first meeting, he had a house outside of Algiers. I had to wait because he was meeting with the North Koreans first. And, after an hour or so, the short guys in black suits, they came out, got in a limousine and drove away. And then I went up and then we had our meetings. But after a few days, it became very clear they were planning a kamikaze attack on New York City, wipe out the police, blow up the power stations. And, that was a little bit more than I had bargained for.
Yeah. There's a definite moment where it feels like you're trying to take a step backwards and let's just take a moment here.
One night we're going back from his house back to Algiers, and we're going through the town square there, which was featured in Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers, one of my favorites. And Don Cox, who was the area captain for the Panthers in New Haven, said, that's what it's going to be like in Manhattan. Nobody on the street but cops and Panthers. Anyway, what happens is in the book. I won't spoil it.
No, absolutely not. But I mean, throughout your career, there is this there is this banging together of the creative side and the political, that sometimes they align and sometimes not. They sort of go against each other. They're a bit antagonistic.
Well, I think if you look at it in terms of a life cycle,
right?
Certainly you see a little Horatio Alger kind of character coming up here. I'm going to be what's the better? I like Harry the Rat with Women better. If you ever read that book,
by
Jules Feiffer. But anyway, you're trying to be successful, rich and famous and smart, right? But I achieved most of that before I was 24. Certainly richer and more famous than I ever conceived of being playing in the streets of the Bronx,
right,
a few years earlier. And then running into life and death situations, that does something to you. And then running into some, I run into some of the highest, I'm not just bullshitting here, the current Dalai Lama's teacher and the great Sufi authentic master, and studied with these people a bit.
Yeah.
So I do know about a lot of stuff that is just outside the realm of normal discourse in the West. And so, in some sense, you see a disengaging from the values of the West, and not necessarily becoming East, but simply acknowledging the objectivity of nature. And how the ego is a defense and a coping mechanism, which actually separates you from your feeling of oneness with the place. And that's a long process. And it's certainly not easily done without some very wise men helping you teach you what to do.
But that's it, isn't it? In a sense that going back for a second to what you say about Marty Scorsese, who you like, who you recommend for films and
right. I got a Boxcar Bertha.
Yeah, exactly.
Not again. I mean, Barbara Hershey and David Carradine to be in it. I'm sorry.
Right.
No, Marty was an authentic, I wouldn't call him a master, but a genius at film. I mean, for me, he's not Fellini or Kurosawa, but yet he made, when he was honest, like with Raging Bull or Mean Streets, then you can't do much better than that, I don't think. And of course, on the technical level, he's a master craftsman.
Sure.
Genius.
But I mean, what I sense with someone like Martin Scorsese is he's putting his spirituality and he's putting his that sort of thing. He's putting it into cinema. That's his sort of church. That's his form of worship and prayer. And you seem to be someone who you're quite happy to go for cinema and work on film, but ultimately, that's only a facet of what you're interested in.
Well, look, Marty, I knew Marty pretty well. I know Spielberg pretty well when we were all young together. And these guys lived movies. They were movies there for their whole lives. Movies weren't really my main cultural thing. But I read books and, and I was much more interested in European thought, frankly, than American. And, for me, movies was like, I know how to drive a cab. I need to make money. Actually, I don't, but that's what movies were for me. Unless you could use them towards something like out of it. I definitely wanted to break down the illusion of reality of high school. Same for radicalization and the revolutionary, the illusions that these revolutionaries have, especially the radicals in the States, thinking they were revolutionaries when really they just wanted to avoid the army. They didn't want to kill people. Or even dealing, people who, that was a joke, but still, for me, it was interesting to see, Harvard people have internalized the values of our society almost, and we're going to become the establishment, the elite, and run the show.
Right.
But what happens when one of them becomes a criminal? Because they're all just servicing their own egos. They no longer have any ethical or moral consideration. And yet that's an advancement, believe it or not, in the evolution of the spirit, to go from a level of believing in high school or or having the ethics of a radical or having the ego primacy of a criminal who believes only in himself. Those are all movements forward, believe it or not, in separating from the ego. I mean, Nunzio came after that, and that's really where you have come to see that your ego, for me, I realized the ego was my enemy. I was going to make a movie about that. But, that's what they call, when you're deluded that your brilliant ideas, that you don't have an ego, but really your ego has just moved on to all your brilliant ideas. You're still full of shit, but you love your shit. Then, after that, you really become a misanthrope, and you get sick of yourself, you're sick of society, and that's where you exit to the desert. And that's when you either kill yourself or start serious work of what were you saying? Start destroying what you thought was important. And it takes a while to come up with a new way of being. You don't do it in a second. There's a card in the tarot of the Hanged Man. The tarot is actually not a prognostication device. It's a medieval system of psychological development. And the Hanged Man is when you reach that point where you're hanging up, life is upside down because you've rejected the materialism of this world. And all the money falls out of your pockets because you're hanging upside down. But anyway, there are all these various steps. So anyway.
When does that start happening with you then? When do you feel that you've got to that point where you just think I've got to sort of destroy myself or start working on myself?
Well, I would say there are two key elements, three. One was certainly with my father-in-law, who owned Western Union and Western Union International. The Supreme Court of the United States, after an 11-year antitrust battle, ruled that he owned the cables going to Europe and the satellites. He had a monopoly on all information going to Europe. And the Supreme Court ruled, hey, it's a monopoly. You got to get rid of one of them. I still remember coming in one morning with the New York Times held over my head, announcing the Supreme Court, making him divest. And I said to him, hey, they got you now, Bill. You're screwed. and I loved him. He was a wonderful man, really. And he said, you come with me. And we went into a side room. I read about this in the book. We go into a side room, and he picks up the phone and says, hey, Sid. Yeah. Did you see the New York Times this morning? Yeah. Okay, well, look. What do you say? You take the satellites, I'll take the steel mills. He said, oh, okay. So look, you send your guys up on Tuesday. I'll send my guys down there, and we'll trade them.
Right.
Okay, fine. And he hung up. I mean, it didn't take more than 5 minutes. This is after 11 years of antitrust for the Supreme Court of the United States. And that radicalized me for life.
Right.
People have no idea. Even these radical left-wing writers have no idea how, for the last 50 years, how it was so much worse than they ever imagined. So much worse. Now it's finally 50 years later, people saying, there's an income disparity. Where have you been for 2 generations?
Yeah.
Right? It's all been happening. Now it's just, this is called the mature state of capitalism.
That's it, isn't it? It seems like the 1%ers, it feels like it's more naked and more exaggerated than everybody.
Oh, wait. I do that in the revolutionary. You're not listened to in this society anymore, mainstream, unless you're rich. Rich equals smart and control. Nobody questions the idea that rich is good, or that rich is smart, or that rich should be aspired to. So, but, if you read I studied economics, for quite a while at Harvard with John Galbraith. I tell some, that's the other way I got into the movies. I went to an economics lunch with Galbraith, and I was so excited about his thought about Keynesian economics. And then he introduced me to his date, who is Angie Dickinson.
These people just keep cropping up in your book with amazing regularity. Julie Christie, you just bump into and say, "Oh, can you be in my movie?"
Well, no, not quite. Right. Certainly, Angie Dickinson was totally coincidence.
Right.
I was so interested in John Maynard Keynes. Who knew that I had never seen such a beautiful woman in my entire life, in real life.
Right.
I'm sorry, I just never saw anybody even close to that level of beauty. And I remember thinking in my brain, I said, whatever field this woman is in, I am going to spend my life in that field. So sex has a primacy. I mean, beauty is just an amazing thing when you're a visually oriented person. It's just, oh, I couldn't believe how beautiful she was. Anyway, what was the point of all of this?
We were talking about the rich and the mature stage of capitalism. Or
all right.
The
so,
rancid stage of capitalism.
Yeah. So wait, on the one hand, I get this John Galbraith and my Keynesian and the history of economic thought. You know, you go through from Malthus to Malthus today is the only one who's got it right. War, famine, pestilence, natural disasters, pandemics. He had it all.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was the first economist. But then Adam Smith and Ricardo and, going on. Anyway, but still, I was thrown off the rails by Angie Dickinson.
The dichotomy.
But just apropos of Julie, I fell in love with Julie when I saw her in Billy Liar walking down the street on the screen. I just couldn't believe it. And she became a fantasy figure for me. And when I was going to do Out of It, my first movie, and the character has a fantasy about getting together with Julie Christie. So and those were the days there was no internet. Writing a telegram was an expensive business. Your father is dead or something like that.
Right.
I wrote her a 20-page telegram telling her how she had to be in my movie. And it was, if she was ever coming through Kennedy, I could just run to Kennedy and just get 5 seconds of her. It would be all I needed to put in the movie. And she wrote back. She said, unfortunately, she's not coming through the U.S., blah, blah, blah. But she's working with Peter Whitehead on Let's Make Love in London Tonight.
Right.
And they sent me some outtakes that I could use in my movie.
Brilliant.
Now, so it wasn't just coincidence that I ran into her. I mean, many years later, I was married to, this great heiress, and just married. And there's a knock on the door. I open, it's Julie. What bad timing. Oh, my God. She was in New York to promote the Richard Lester film with George Scott, Petulia.
Petulia, yes.
Yeah, and she was there. And we got along great, I mean, nothing. I mean, I really liked her when I met her completely, but I was still I was just married. I didn't have I was still a bit of a Boy Scout.
With dreams like these, who needs nightmares? The other person that I have to ask you about, obviously, is Terrence Malick, because you produced Badlands, and you and you put that together. How did that come about?
Well, it's a long story, but in a nutshell, Terry was good friends with a guy named Jake Brackman.
From Harvard as well, right?
Yeah. He wrote the lyrics for a lot of Carly Simon songs. And he wrote Bob Rafelson's King of Marvin Gardens. But he hadn't done this at this point.
Right.
I'm really leaving out a lot. But basically, Jake and I worked on a project together. And, we knew each other quite well. And Terry, I guess, was Jake's best friend. I mean, you would know this better than I, even if you're working on Terry material. Jake doesn't show up in the Terry material?
Oh, no, he does. Yeah. He's they meet in Harvard, and they work together on The New Yorker. And I think when he's in New York, I think even there's a Carly Simon connection as well with Terry that I think they briefly dated.
Who you briefly dated? What?
Jake was really close with Carly Simon, and Carly Simon briefly dated Terry, but she sort of says that she got the feeling that Terry and Jake should be dating.
Well, that I think is a great insight. I made out with Carly one afternoon at Jake, so she's very smart. There's some good stories with Carly. Anyway, by that time I had learned a little bit about sometime later taking people's pain away with my hands. And so Carly was about to go on at the Troubadour, and she had a migraine headache. and she saw I was in the crowd, and she asked me to come back. So I went back there and laying on the hands, got rid of her migraine. She gets on stage. She has a great performance. And afterwards, John, what's his name? Taylor comes back. James Taylor. And they meet and fuck in the bathroom. But anyway, that going back to Carly, I think she's quite right about Jake and Terry. But in any event, so Jake told me that Terry wanted to do this movie.
Right.
And then they got him together with me and Ed. I'm leaving out a lot.
yeah. I noticed. I noticed. But we can talk about that later anyway, as maybe off the microphone we can talk about that. Right. Going back to the politics, I guess, one of the things that struck me in the book, and you mention it as the book goes on, is you sort of seem to see things all the way through as they're changing, and people from the 60s aren't necessarily following that same trajectory. And I'm thinking most obviously would be John Voight, who goes from being in The Revolutionary and Midnight Cowboy to his sort of present manifestation.
Right.
Still a wonderful actor, still does some wonderful work, but frankly, a bit, well, put it this way, not in my political camp.
Right. Well,
Perhaps not in anybody's. Perhaps in a bit of a political camp on his own.
There are 30 million Americans who believe what he believes. Well, first, I just want to say I love John from the first moment I met him.
Right.
He's just such an extraordinary talent. I mean, it was almost like it was more than meeting Angie Dickinson, if you can believe that.
Wow.
Wow. No, he was, and at the same meeting, who was there? Ally McGraw. And they were all at the same William Morris agent, a guy named Marty Davidson. And I was looking for people out of it. And I met John. And, this is the truth. Ed Pressman had signed Barry Gordon to do the lead because he wanted a name. And the main character was like me, not like some schlep, what Molly Haskell called, anyway. The guy, was a bit of a nerd and a dork, as you might say. And they became a movie about that. But it wasn't written that way. The character was much stronger. And when I told Ed that I'd met the perfect guy to play me, he said, sorry, well, you already spent $10,000. I said, this kid, I'm telling you, is a movie. It's just unbelievable.
Right.
And Ed wouldn't budge. So I said to John, look, I got a partner here, and he won't go along with this, but I can tell you, you're the greatest thing I ever saw. Let's make this movie together. Take one of the smaller parts, and I'll write a movie for you. So I knew from the first second that John was an immense talent. And then, of course, I learned a lot about Sandy Meisner and the neighborhood playhouse, this little class with John Voight. And the other members of the class were Dustin Hoffman, Al Pacino, Bob Duvall, Chris Walken. I mean, unbelievable.
Talentless. What a bunch of talentless.
But in one class, in one acting class.
I know.
So, what you have to know is that Sandy Meisner was a bit of a genius. He doesn't get the acknowledgement that he should.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, he was an egotist too. He became a bitter old man. Instead of taking pride in the fact that he had taught all the greatest actors. Did I say Pacino was there too?
Yeah.
It was sad. I met Meisner a few times because he came to the set of The Revolutionary,
right,
to see Duvall and Voight, and I really thought the world of him, and it got diminished when I met him in person.
All right, because he wasn't as
his ego was fucked up.
So what happened to Voight? Do you think? What was the? I guess what happened to Voight might be asking as well. What happened to 30 million Americans?
Hey, Eldridge Cleaver ended up making pants before he died.
Right.
I can't tell you how many of the left-wing guys. I'm the last one, and I went spiritual.
But is your spiritual path? Do you feel that that's in any way a sort of renunciation of the political, or do you think it's an extension of that?
Well, I think it grew out of it for sure, because you see that, like in Ukraine, you got He goes on the American side and he goes on the Russian side, and they both do propaganda against each other. The U.S. you never hear a word about how, everybody who was smart in the U.S. said get rid of NATO after the Soviet Union collapsed. But we're a military-industrial warring economy. We need wars. And so we get a dose of propaganda here, and you get a different dose in China, Russia, India, Brazil, where I am now. War comes from ego. As long as people have egos, there's going to be war. I mean, Marx called the war of all against all, right? Capitalism. Anyway, and so Einstein said, the world is going to blow itself up unless we get a new way of thinking. And I see no evidence at all of a new way of thinking. Although I did meet Herman Kahn, and we spent time together, and we talked about our acid trips. And on his acid trip, it's in the book, he said, you will get a change of consciousness on his acid trip. You will get a change of consciousness in the 21st century, but only until 1 million people a day are dying of hunger. If you see every week, another 7 million people are dead, it will start changing the way people are thinking. And instead of building all this war machinery, we'll start building transportation for food. But that was his acid trip. I'm not saying it's reality, but, but it gives you an insight into the whole deal.
Waking up the next morning.
Anyway, in answer to your question, the spiritual thing, I think, is simply, on some level, quite objective when you see through the delusions of personality and power politics. But what I find most interesting personally is I realized that Marx got it wrong. He thought the antithesis of capitalism would be socialism. But the antithesis of the antithesis of capitalism is planetary suicide, extinction. In other words, the capitalist system creates the gas chamber of planet Earth. We don't have to worry about a lot of these things because capitalism is committing suicide by making the planet uninhabitable for civilizations.
By making everyone commit suicide, essentially.
Well, so I just had an idea about that a few days ago. But that there's Einstein, and then I came across the Einstein thing about he's saying that same thing a long time ago. That you have, unless you get a whole new way of thinking. I mean, in that sense, Greta Thunberg is a more important thinker than anybody else on the planet at the moment. But of course, nothing political will work because it's all based on opposition, and everything creates its opposite.
I mean, if we look at history, don't we see that political things have worked? I mean, we have had progress. We have moved forward. So why would that end? Why would we not be able to do that?
Well, have you read this what's his name? Piketty?
Yeah, Thomas Piketty, the French economist.
Have you read his stuff?
Yeah, Capital. Yeah, I've read his stuff.
Oh, okay. So, things have gotten a lot better. A lot better. Poverty, war, all these things are improving tremendously. The real culprit, though, is money. It's to make more. The model of growth capitalism is that you have to grow. Now, it's true. You could say, well, we could help with all of this out if we didn't have eliminated the progressive income tax 60 years ago. But this vast inequality and this total dedication to the god of profit and money. I mean, people would rather have jets and palaces than help starving people in the neighborhood. So until you this is where the Buddhists come in, Dalai Lama. He says, the starting point is compassion. And actually, capitalism has pretty much killed compassion. So now it's becoming ultimately extremely materialistic. But that's not the important part. The important part is the industrial process that's creating the gas chamber of Earth. Hannah Arendt says, hopefulness is what discourages courageous action. All the Jews who thought, we're just getting on the trains to be relocated to, they were very hopeful that they were going, everything's fine. And they all got gassed, right? Those who didn't accept the hope, who said, we're going to our death, were the ones who survived and took effective action against what was opposing them. Well, there is no courageous action. Right now, the whole green movement is a delusion. I mean, we are so far past the point of no return. And the Gates scholars at Cambridge, who must be among the brightest people on earth, right?
Right.
They go and they get the people from all over, pay their way, blah, blah, blah. And most of them, believe it or not, are studying how to fight climate change. That's what they're doing. And they're coming up with all kinds of brilliant ideas about how to make green more profitable than fossil fuels, and as if the game's still in play. And you see the ads from the oil companies and the politicians, oh, we're fighting climate change, blah, 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 green, blah, blah, blah. Well, there was a wonderful time I talked with the heads of the Gates program at Cambridge, who are teaching these brilliant little kids. And what do you think of all these kids? Apropos of you're saying, well, it's all going to work out history. And they said, well, we really appreciate these young minds. They're really, the best we can do. But it's way too late. There's no way. You would have had to start 40 years ago with some massive programs. And right now, we're still not reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Even though it was, so they are saying, forget it. I'm not talking about, radicals now. I'm talking about the Gates professors at Cambridge. So, boy, did I say a mouthful here, huh?
Yeah, wow. We've I don't even want to start because I've got such a pessimistic view of the future that if I begin, people will turn this podcast off and never listen to it again, and they'll run into the seat screaming.
I do that whole thing on Thomas Malthus in the book.
Yeah, well, Malthus it was absolutely right. Everyone has this cocky idea that Malthus, he got it so wrong. What an idiot. But it was like, no, he didn't foresee fertilizer. He didn't foresee... That was his one mistake. He didn't foresee a technological improvement that doesn't in any way abnegate the rest of his ideas.
He was just a few hundred years ahead of his time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's funny. Joel Cohen, he was head of the Rockefeller Institute.
Not to be mistaken with the film director, Joel Cohen.
Yeah. No, this guy's a genius the world's leading genius on population. And he was on the Crimson with Jake and me and a lot of people. And he actually did the music for Chanson, the film about the French village. He played the piano in Adam's house. So, but I stayed a little bit in touch with him. Anyway, he said basically, this was about 8 years ago. He said population is really not a problem. The world can support. First of all, the world population will even out at around 8 billion or 11 billion. And then it really won't grow anymore. And we have the capacity to feed that many people. So what they weren't figuring was that land would become non-arable, the air would become saturated, the oceans would be at 95% CO2 capacity, and the methane contained in the tundra and the permafrost is equal to all the CO2 produced since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution will be released in 40 years. So, I know this, and I think certain other people know this, but man, you don't see it on the TV.
Paul Schrader put it in his first Reformed film, which was...
Yeah, no, I know Paul Schrader. I had a fun time with Schrader when we, in that group in Hollywood. I used to know him pretty well, and he would come out every weekend to Margot. I was living with Margot Kidder, and Marty would come by, and Keitel, and all these guys. Schrader would come by too on the weekends, but he never would show up on non-weekends. And I finally said, "What are you doing?" He says, he's in his room in Santa Monica, and he's writing 3 scripts that are all going to be incredible. But he doesn't want to show anybody any script because he wants to direct. And he figures if he can show him 3 scripts and say, okay, you only get to make these if I direct the first one. That's how I'll get to be the director. We were all talking about how to become a director. I already was a director, but I was younger than all of them.
Right.
So it was weird.
That was his plan. That was his master plan.
And he put it into effect, and he did it. And I love Paul Schrader's movies, by the way, much more than a lot of more famous directors. I just think he's an excellent writer and director and a smart guy.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, I was just looking for a way of sort of ending our conversation on a positive note. The positive note is that you can get to a place of serenity. Right.
And harmony.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know, they talk about luck. One day I'm broke, I'm in town, and the guy calls me, says this guy, Tom Monahan, who founded Domino's Pizza, billionaire, is best friends with Pope John Paul II, and he wants to do a film about him. Why don't you come and meet Tom Monahan? You can consult with him because he doesn't know anything about the film business. So I said, well, how much money is involved? So maybe you get $25,000. I said, wow, so that night I read up everything I can about John Paul II on the internet and Tom Monahan. I become an expert on Monahan and the Pope. Next day, I meet him at 4:00 at his lawyer's office, and we start talking about a film on John Paul II. And I talk endlessly about John Paul's mysticism and, matters of the spirit.
Right.
And at the end of the 2 hours, he says, please come to dinner with me. Could you come to dinner with us? I said, and I asked my lawyer, was there? He said, yeah, let me call my wife. We go to the Four Seasons. They've got wines that were decanted by a sommelier from Ann Arbor, ordered at ours, and $2,500 a bottle, this kind of stuff. And I'd never had such wine in my life, by the way. But where am I going? Oh yeah. So we go on talking some more, and at one point he says, I've taken a vow of poverty. I only spend money on food and travel, and but all the rest of the money I'm giving away. I'm going to die broke. And I said to him, really? Me too. When are you going to die? And the lawyers, everybody looked at me. Oh. Now I said, no, come on, Tom. Tell him when you're going to die. Because, if you're going to die broke, you got to figure out when you're going to die. Right? And he says, absolutely true. I said, do you have a reverse amortization schedule to give away the money? He said, yes. And I said, good. And we hit it off great. Right? And then when my lawyer goes to the limo with Tom, leaves me behind to see if we can make our $25,000 deal, Tom says to my lawyer, he's the only guy in Hollywood we met with in 2 days of all these meetings who never talked about the deal. He said, I want this guy to produce the movie. That's how I got the job. $55 million movie. Anyway, what I'm really trying to say is, I guess, something about when I got to meet the Pope and all this kind of stuff, there's something that Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, the Pope, Oscar Tazo, for me, it's real. It's not, hoobie jooby, blah, blah, blah. There are real human beings on this planet who are authentic mystics, who have really learned something about serenity, peacefulness, and objectivity. Objectivity is very important to all these people. They aren't deluded by one set of propaganda or another. They're not ruled by the need for fame and fortune at this point. And they have studied how to get there. So, yeah, if I want to leave somebody with an optimistic point of view, yes, serenity and happiness and joy are all in the moment. They're not in the future. They're not in the past. It's right now. Right now. And you will get very, very happy. Now, I have to say, since I'm so old and, Ed Pressman just died last week, so mortality is on my mind. And which is quite all right with me. I'm happy with it. But I did read it, Ratzinger, the Nazi Pope, died a few weeks ago. Of course, I got to know Ratzinger and the Pope and all those people in 2000, 2004 when I was in the Vatican studying with these, getting this all together. And I didn't like Ratzinger at all. Right. He's a real conservative asshole. But he wrote something that was really relevant to your question, which I've been thinking a little bit about these days, about the moment of death. No, certainly all Buddhists talk about all of life being a preparation for death. But he talked about what is the moment of death. Well, if you can get to this point of serenity and peace and objectiveness, that you can go into this place called the void, which is one of the restful, basic places you can go. It's like being in outer space or something. No thought, but at the moment of death, you go into, if you conceive of it as an ocean of love, Okay. That really what you're doing in that moment is you go into that moment, which is totally in the present and totally surrounding and totally loving. Now, what happened? That's a very interesting construct. I have no idea if it's true or not, but I like the idea of it. And I don't know if you I wrote another book called The Image of a Spirit.
No, I haven't read that, no.
Well, anyway, when my mother died, I took a bunch of pictures of her for the hour and a half after she died with the BlackBerry. And so the BlackBerry captured images of a person of some sort. It's in the book, leaving her body.
Yes.
And I spent 3 or 4 years going to, the leading experts on the planet,
right,
showing him this stuff. So it's clear. And I gave a talk at Harvard about this too, that at the moment of death.
That's in the book as well. And someone says you have a lot of nerve giving.
Right. I say I have no idea what happens after death. Oh, not what happened, but what it all means. But I am certain of the fact that something happens. And you may not be conscious of it, but you can take a picture of it with the right camera. Anyway, that'll woo.
So we're sending our listeners now into the ocean of love. Remember, if you're not happy now listening to this podcast, that's it. You have got no chance. So I'll just say thank you very much to Paul Williams for talking to us, and thank you, Paul. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you.
$1-800-Flowers.com knows that a gift is never just a gift. A gift is an expression of everything you feel and helps to build more meaningful relationships. 1-800-Flowers takes the pressure off by helping you navigate life's important moments by making it simple to find the perfect gift. From flowers and cookies to cake and chocolate, 1-800-Flowers helps guide you in finding the right gift to say how you feel. To learn more, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.